So thanks everyone for coming. If you or your organization would like information on becoming a member, go ahead and visit calmuseums.org/membership. We're here today doing the webinar Cybersecurity for All with Julia Falkowski and Ryan Prindeville. This program is supported in part by Associated Foundations Incorporated in memory of Barry Herlihy. Thank you everyone for coming today. I'm going to go ahead and welcome our presenters and thank them for taking the time to make this happen. I'm also going to ask them to turn on their webcam so you can actually get to see them. I'm going to turn my webcam off. And I'm also going to give them control of the technology and everything that they need to be successful. Julie, I'm going to pass it off to you now.
Great.
So go ahead.
All right. So as Jessica mentioned, I'm the 2018-2019 CAM Technology Fellow for this year. Grateful for the opportunity. And my day job is as a project and production specialist at Balboa Park Online Collaborative. We are located in San Diego, and we're a technology services nonprofit. And we were designed to serve the 17+ museums in Balboa Park. And I want to start off by saying, even if you don't consider yourself a technical person, that this webinar is for you. I would say that I'm more on the kind of content design, project management side of things, but being in Balboa Park Online Collaborative, which does everything from desktop support to Wi-Fi management, I've gotten a sense of the kinds of things that that we can do, even as people who aren't as familiar with technology and people who need to wear many hats as museum professionals. So we're here to kind of spread the good word about cybersecurity and what you can do. And let's see, I'm looking to advance the slide. There we go. I'll let Ryan introduce himself as well.
Hey everybody, Ryan Prindeville here. Like I said, I'm a practice leader within Armanino. Armanino is a large accounting, audit, tax, and consulting organization. We happen to have 750+ nonprofits, including many of those being museums as clients. And I lead our strategy and transformation practice, which is essentially management consulting. So why would a guy who does management consulting care about cybersecurity and cybersecurity in museums nonetheless? Primarily because it's an important topic to our clientele. And we have a major vested interest in making sure that our clientele, including many of you and many of the museums here in California, are successful, long-standing operations, and that you can continue to be successful going into the future. And this is a topic that is very important. We'll talk a little bit about why it matters to museums specifically in a few minutes. Also, on the personal front, my wife is a 20-year museum professional. She's an MLIS degree from UCLA and has been a lead archivist at several museums and members of CAM in the past as well. So I get to talk about it at home is also on a regular basis. So looking forward to having the conversation with all of you.
So I'll start out by giving my sort of non-technical person's introduction to technical tips. And say that, you know, you're all here because you see the value in this and know that there's value. Let's see, Jessica, can I advance the slide once more? There we go. So I think there's a tendency among museum professionals to think that we won't be a target, and partly it's because of that lack of funding. That a lot of people who aren't as familiar with cyber threats might say, you know, why would they be interested in us? What do we have that's of interest to them? We can't pay a big ransom. But I can say that working in the technology services organization, I've seen cyber threats, big and small, happen to or have close encounters with museums. And just as an example of that, this session grew out of a CAM webinar that Ryan participated in last year. Sorry, it wasn't a webinar, it was a CAM session, and it was Cyber Attacks and Hacks Make You Want to Cry. And one of the participants in that was someone that we worked with on technology services, and they had their site compromised by the United Islamic Cyber Force. And at the time, we weren't doing their web support, so we weren't directly involved in that. But we were involved as their desktop support and had to go and make sure that there was nothing on our end that had led to that happening. I've also seen a number of different kinds of attacks, brute force password attacks that fortunately were unsuccessful, lots of spam emails that come through web forms, and seen some near misses with ransomware with different organizations. And ransomware is interesting because they often target civic entities. So why not museums? They're certainly at risk for that as well. Recently, we've been seeing something interesting, which is Google Analytics spam, which throws off the results of your website with sort of bad results for traffic. And again, coming from a non-technical background, I've been able to learn some of these informed tips that, they won't totally protect you, but at least limit your exposure and help you think more holistically about the way that you're set up. So my first tip is be familiar with what your exposure is. Know all the tools that you're using, know who you can turn to, whether that's paid support or maybe it's a board member or a friend who you can ask for help. And then if you're asking someone for help about things, know how. So being as descriptive as possible about the problem that you're seeing or experiencing is very helpful. Screenshots are always good, and that can really turn around the time that it takes to address issues and ease frustration on both sides and eliminate some of the back and forth. The other thing that I've learned is learning how to ask for help. Another important part of that is staying up to date on what's going on. And that's finding different sources of information that might work for you to stay informed. For me personally, I give a few recommendations here. WordFence is a blog. It's a WordPress plugin, but they broadcast free information on their blog about some different threats that they see both to WordPress and Drupal sites. And learning about some of those threats has helped us get ahead of to do updates when we know that something is vulnerable in a way that we wouldn't have been able to without following that and keeping abreast of that information. I also recommend the podcast Reply All, which more than kind of any other podcast has affected the way that I live in a day-to-day world in terms of how I do things online. So there's information about different Amazon sellers who are inconspicuous or not so great, and different hacks that are happening around the world. So just being able to hear about these things and to be able to talk about them, I think is really helpful. And even just following some different tech reporting organizations on Twitter has been really helpful to me. So to be able to, CNN Technology will also tell you about what's going on in the world. And I'll give you my #1 tip for cybersecurity for everyone. And you probably heard it before, but it's don't click on suspicious links. And even though you've heard it before, there are all sorts of tricks. You think you're smart, and they'll always be a step ahead of you. So just always keep an eye out and be vigilant. And with that said, I'll hand things over to Ryan.
Thank you, Julia. I appreciate that. And that's a perfect segue in jumping into the next step here. Let me see if I can take control here.
Try it again.
Maybe we can jump forward for me there. There it goes. All right. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about, leverage some of the stuff that Julia just set the tone with and talk about some trends and developments. I'm going to try to talk about some practical steps that you as a nonprofit, as a museum, some of you may or may not be a combination of different types of entities as well, and talk about how to communicate the importance of this across your organization, whatever that means. Let's jump forward here. So I'm going to put a question out here, and you can feel free to respond either verbally if you're not muted, or in the chat box if you can't. Where do you think museums and most nonprofits as a broad are falling short related to cybersecurity? We talked a little. There was a couple of comments there early on about lack of training, old practices, and not keeping up. I like all those answers. Maybe funding is a little bit as well. Are there any other ideas about where you might be falling short?
Ryan, I think that most museum professionals fall short in that we are behind the curve generally in technology. So you, as a career person, fall behind gradually every year that you're not utilizing the up and coming resources.
I think that's an amazing answer. I'll be perfectly honest, and it tees up the rest of the conversation. I think that's a really good point. Maybe we can jump forward to the next slide here, because I'm going to pull this forward. We can pull a couple of things forward. These are all examples of actual news of nonprofits specifically, but museums as well, that have been in the news. Our goal for this conversation is to try to keep your museum, in many cases our clients, out of the newspaper, right? We don't want any of you and your organizations showing up as having released your clientele information to the public, or maybe your donor information to the public, because I'm going to venture another question to you. What's the most important thing for most museums and nonprofits to protect? What's the most valuable thing you have?
Your donor database.
Okay. And if the donor database gets out, what happens?
Okay, Sterling says, Your
Honor.
Honor.
Yeah, Your Honor. I think that's a good. Reputation. I think that's a variation of it, Sterling, and I appreciate it. I was going to say your reputation, because for most organizations, you're going to be donor based one way or the other. Grant based, donor based organizations. If your reputation is hammered by being in the news for something like this, I will make the assertion that your donor base and your ability to grab grants for future years will be affected. And we have seen that with other organizations. I'm going to jump this forward here.
They agree with you?
Yep. There it goes. So I'm going to pull this forward. I intentionally used non-museum examples right here. And I don't look like it wants to advance here. There it goes. All right. Here's 4 different types of nonprofits. I didn't want to put any museums that might be on the call today as examples. These are real examples of organizations that had public reputation affecting breaches in the last year. These do seriously affect the public reputation, which then affects your ability to hire in some cases, retain, to bring in donations, to bring in your credibility. And I like the verbiage of Your Honor there, Sterling. I think that was interesting as well, because it's sort of true, right? Are people going to believe and honor that you're treating their information in a respectful way if you can't protect it when they have a relationship with you as an organization? So last year there was a big well-publicized set of attacks called WannaCry. Ultimately, it turned out to be a lot about nothing, and it was something that could have been easily protected. But a lot of nonprofits, museums, large public organizations even were affected by it. It was not a sophisticated attack. It was a broad-based attack that affected a lot of organizations. Why? Primarily because they were not prepared and didn't take basic steps that would allow them to protect themselves. This was an example, and this is an example from last year, but there's been many examples in the news since that are relevant. This is a nice one because it's practical, and it makes it relevant to the comment that was there earlier about running Windows XP and having some of the old devices. And a lot of times the board or funding organizations, your donors, other people, they want their funding to go to programs and other things that are going to deliver services. But if the organization is shut down or made ineffective because we haven't protected the things that we're already using, or set aside funding to do this, and time to take care of ourselves were just as ineffective at delivering that content. Why was WannaCry effective in one way? Because it took advantage of organizations that weren't prepared. I will also make the assertion that, like some of you alluded to earlier, many museums are not prepared today, primarily because of lack of focus, funding, and historical just attention, because it wasn't a top 10 priority list. The WannaCry virus was something that was completely defendable. Every organization could do it if you had Windows updates up to date, if you were using firewalls and antivirus software, and if team members within the organization were wary when reading emails, and then if data was regularly backed up. None of those organizations that were severely impacted, some of them very large, would have been impacted. So here's a question for you. How many of you work in Starbucks or other public areas and use the Wi-Fi often? You can answer verbally or.
I have, and I've stopped doing it because it's too risky.
I like it. Michelle says never, and a few other people on there too.
I'll admit I do.
I do sometimes.
Okay, look, the answer is probably that all of us have or do at some point along the way, right? The key thing to think about there is, does your machine that you're using have antivirus, have the protections? Is it up to date? And is your organization running a firewall? If you're using a laptop that belongs to your organization and so forth. And the reason this is important is public Wi-Fi is very exposed. And this is just trying to make it tangible for you. Public Wi-Fi is almost always very exposed. There are malicious actors out there, and there are easy ways to get into your machine, unless you have taken very basic steps that most of you probably have some sort of an outsourced computer help person or organization, like Julia's organization that she works with, that can help you understand what the key antivirus and updates are for your laptops that will give you some basic protections. And we'll keep moving. We'll describe this a little more. Oops. So now we just talked about the fact that we've exposed ourselves. We've all worked in a Starbucks or at the local coffee shop or the hotel if we're traveling to the conference this year, right? Maybe we used the Wi-Fi there as well, or somewhere else, right? I'm guessing we all used it at the conference last year for those of us who were there. 80% of nonprofits, let alone museums, don't have adequate data backup and protection to safeguard sensitive donor data. So somebody said donor data is the most important piece. I would agree, with the exception of the fact that donor data really is related to reputation. Okay, so you're not alone. Now, why is it important that you're not alone? Here's something. So I work within an accounting and consulting organization. The AICPA is the organization that it's the largest organization of accountants across the country, and sets out some of the patterns for which auditors look at risk within organizations. Last year, Sue Coffey, who's one of the key leaders within the AICPA, said that for auditors of not just large public and private organizations, but also nonprofits and museums, the number one threat to survival of an organization is cybersecurity. And so they put it out there for all auditors and all consulting organizations within the AICPA to go and coach our clients that this is a number one threat and risk that you as an organization have going forward. So what does that mean? Cybersecurity is issue number one: common hacking risks, credit card fraud from online contributions, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And the highest risks are things like patient data, donor data, those kind of things, because those are the reputation risk. Usually the credit card risk you can deal with quickly. It's a pain and it takes away from your staff and people's time and effort. But the data of your team members, employees, your constituencies, and your donors is probably the number one risk. So why is this important? Why should museums care today? It used to be that the big enterprises were the big goal for hackers and for information out there in the world. That's not the case anymore. Most of those organizations have locked themselves down and spent millions and millions of dollars to drive cybersecurity and have major programs driving it. When we teed off this conversation, you all talked about being underfunded, undermanned, and maybe lack of knowledge, I think, right? Or three of the topics we talked about. It's not just you who know that now, it's also the bad guys. They figured it out as well. Why do they want to do that? Because now there's a whole economy for malware and for organized hacking as well. There are intentional distributions of malware that get set out. They target victims. They target weak spots in the environment and the ecosystem. Those weak spots, guess what we just said? We just said we have an industry, we have a group of peers, right, that are underfunded, lack of knowledge, and lack of focus, right? You have weak spots. Why do they do that? Because they're going to do it to try to do ransomware. Ransomware may or may not affect a museum. In some cases, Julia gave an example earlier that there was one there. They also want access to things like your resources to launch other attacks. If they can go onto your server that's sitting in a back corner of your museum and launch something from your domain and get into another constituents organization, or maybe one of your donors organizations. We had a large Fortune 50 organization that donated a lot of money and time to one of our nonprofit clients, and that nonprofit client was compromised, and their domain was used to spam their large Fortune 50 donor, thousands of people who then clicked on links because it came from a trusted domain. That nonprofit was used as essentially a guise for a larger attack. The other thing that's happening now is privacy regulations are expanding, but they're wacky. They're different in all different types of countries. Not just privacy regulations, but also the legislation on what and how you're supposed to protect your donor, constituent, and stakeholder information. So even if you are a small museum in California or a mid-sized museum in California, you may have donor and stakeholder information from other places all around the world. We have very little controls in parts of the world for both privacy and for rules and regulations around what can be done and protected. That makes the environment even more confounding, and makes it important that we are vigilant on the things we can control. We're not going to control the policies and regulations of governments and foreign places and so forth. We can control what we do to protect ourselves. All right, now we'll make it practical and tactical again. How many of you use the same password for your home and work accounts? Let's see what kind of responses we get. Sometimes. All right. I'm willing to bet that if I could find out your home Yahoo email account password, it's probably pretty close to your work password for either your laptop, your Windows credentials, or your email, or somewhere else. And if that is the case, I suggest you go change it immediately. One of the easiest ways for people with malicious intent to gain access to your organization, other than having you click a link, like Julia mentioned earlier, in your email, is to access personal email accounts like Yahoo email, or we mentioned, some of the other public email account offerings out there. And then get access to a file there, follow up, figure out what your password is there, and then attack everything that they can find out about you from your personal life. It's called social engineering. It happens regularly, and it starts with very basic finding out basic information about you, and then attacking everything around you, and then using you as a means to get at your organization, to use that organization as a means to get at something larger. So that's a very practical thing, is keep different types of passwords for different means and platforms that you're accessing. All right. So what can your museum do about this? It sounds daunting, right? It sounds crazy. I'm going to venture a guess to say, I didn't ask the question earlier, but how many people think that cybersecurity is a technology problem?
The people problem.
Thank you. You just segued me perfectly. Yeah, cybersecurity for the truth is it's a people problem. The vast majority of organizations can do something about how we react and how we act because it's a people problem. And I love that paradise. It can happen to anybody. You're absolutely right. It can happen to you personally. It can happen to your family. It can happen to your church, your school, your work, your any different types of places. So part of what we're talking about here is not necessarily having to be a technical expert, like Julia said. It's knowing enough to be helpful, and then to pull the people together. So one thing is to engage your board of directors. Second part is to establish a cybersecurity program. We'll talk about what that means. It doesn't mean you have to be a big, scary, high expense situation. Collaborate and communicate. Talk about it within your organization, within your board. What are we doing? What aren't we doing? Are we making intentional decisions on what we're going to protect and what we're not? And then implement proper governance. That can be as heavy as locking everything down and not letting anybody touch anything on the internet, to having policies and procedures and coaching your team and staff about what they should be doing. All right. We'll jump forward. So what does it mean to engage your board? One is, as an organization, your role, and I don't know everybody's roles in your organization today, but we recommend, as our audit team on my peers on the audit side of the organization, as well as when we advise boards and executive directors of organizations, that you evaluate the board composition. Do you have somebody on the board who can act as an advisor, who has knowledge in this space, who can help you from that perspective to provide oversight and advisory, right? Does the board understand that there's a fiduciary responsibility to some of these situations too? The likelihood is they probably don't. Do they understand that the organization has to put systems and controls in place to manage these risks? And then have conversations, include it in the topics with the board. What do we have a risk? What are those risks? Bring it to their attention. What is the strategy, the governance structure that fits into kind of and this is a big topic, or a big conversation, a big word, ERM. Forget that word. It really means having a conversation with the board and decide, and the leadership team, and deciding how you're going to handle it going forward. Do you have an incident response process? What happens? Do people know what to do if there is an incident? Have we talked about it? And then review your insurance policies. That's a simple one that most of your organizations probably have a brokerage that you're dealing with. I know at the CAM conferences, there's usually a couple of insurance brokers who participate and plan. At the conference last year, I spoke with two of the providers there that did have very discrete and distinct kind of assessments that they can perform to look at your policy and your risk profile, and to see how that could work for you as well. Jessica, there it goes. All right. So when we talk to large organizations, we talk about the elements of a cybersecurity program. This applies to any organization as well, and one person can do it, and you can do it in a few minutes, okay? But you can make it as big or as small as you want, but it's important to understand the components. One is assessing your situation and thinking about it regularly. This isn't a one-time set it away and forget it situation, because as somebody mentioned earlier, things change. The technology changes, your people change. You might have people come and go from your organization. Maybe you have volunteers or part-time employees or seasonal team members, depending on your organization, docents that access technology as well, those types of situations. So it's important to assess your situation and then rotate through this cycle periodically. One is, we talked about reputation earlier. How do we know what are the things that are going to affect our reputation? We start by understanding the data that we have in our organization. That's kind of our crown jewels, right? Are we maintaining lists of major donors and high net worth individuals that we are expecting, donations from? Where do we have that data? How is it? Do we have employee databases and social security numbers and those types of things on file? Do we have other sensitive information, depending on the type of organization, the type of museum that we are, that we need to think about it? Implement some of those security controls, and they could be as tactical as changing passwords. They could be as having a password policy and having the tools in place to manage it. Occasionally testing it. What do we ever test people to see? Do our teams and people know what the risk is? And then assess it again and go back through. This is a framework, and there's a lot behind it that we're happy to provide more information on some of the steps behind that as well. But it's a cycle. I'll make the assertion here again that this is not meant to not to be scary. It's meant to be a framework for conversation to start the dialogue with your board and your leadership team. There we go. That framework, then now you can extend it beyond just what's inside your walls. A lot of time, we talked a little bit about going to Starbucks or using the Wi-Fi at the hotel or using other locations. Well, your vendors who may or may not be accessing your own network also extend your risk. And this is kind of like looking at your house at home. And a couple of my partners here in the office, we use the analogy that says your security perimeter doesn't end necessarily at your front door at your house, right? You might have security cameras on the outside of your house, or you might have a fence or a lock on your gate or something along those lines as well. Your perimeter for your organization is not necessarily just with the number of laptops or desktops in your office. It could be on the mobile devices that maybe you have people who are taking sensitive email or donor information or personal information and taking that on personal devices. It could be with vendors who take maybe have access to your systems, your data. Maybe you have part-time employees that work remotely that access your registration, your donor list as well. Those are all things to think about. And if we think about our program and thinking about where is the data, who has access to it, what tools are they using to access it, and what's the risk if their device gets, they're probably not going to do anything malicious themselves. You're probably hiring and engaging with very reputable individuals and vendors and partners. Accidentally, things get exposed. Laptops get stolen out of a car. What are those scenarios? The last bullet there is an important one, and a lot of organizations don't understand that most of contracts that you might have with a third-party vendor, most of the time you have the right to audit their policies and procedures as well. So that means if somebody is doing an upgrade for you, or they're helping you roll out a new information access software or a catalog software. My wife was a librarian in archives and museums for a long time. We talked about cataloging software. Those vendors that might install something for you or do something, you have the right to exercise an audit on their policies and procedures as well. How are they helping you protect your data? And I think it's very important. A lot of organizations don't do that and don't talk about how the vendors extend your risk and how they can help protect you as well. So what do you do? In this case, we talk about taking that framework we talked about and doing it on an ongoing basis. For those organizations that do have maybe you have a IT provider or like Julia was working with a nonprofit technology provider that works with museums, or maybe you have a managed services provider that is doing some sort of work with you. Many of those organizations can help you by doing kind of a third-party risk assessment, a vulnerability assessment.
And what should you include when we ask donor management vendors? Like, what should we include in our business requirements?
That's a really good point. Yeah, a really good point. And I think you're asking specifically when we talk to our vendors, what types of questions should we ask them?
So we sound like we know what we're talking about, especially for organizations who might be behind. You don't always know the right questions to ask. And Michelle, who's asking this question, I just want to make sure I'm accurately reflecting what your intent is. So feel free to type some more if you have more to add on.
Yeah, I think Michelle, I think that's a good question, and part of this is to talk about these things, right? And to say, what are your areas of risk, right? What do they see as the areas that you should be focused on, based on your size of organization, based on your risk profile? Some vendors can offer you to do a risk assessment, and that's kind of where we're going here. That then helps you get a sense for what are those points that you do need to take into account and address, and to help you prioritize what those risk points are as well.
Great.
And when we talk about remediation, a lot of times people fix the symptom. It's kind of like going to the doctor, right? So I'll use the analogy here that if your organization, you may or may not know you have an illness as an individual, right? But you go to the doctor for an annual checkup to do some preventative work, right? So that's kind of your ongoing assessment. If there's an issue, you may not go to your primary care physician. If your arm is bleeding, you may not go to you might go to the ER and have a triage nurse and somebody take a look at you immediately to try to figure out what the immediate problem is. So the ongoing assessment is kind of like getting your regular checkups and being proactive. Remediation is going to be fixing an issue at that time. Remediation is a lot easier if you've already had kind of assessed your situation and know where your risk points are, because then you can focus on the root cause versus on the symptom. The symptom may be that you can't access one computer, but the root cause may be something beyond that says you might have many computers affected and we need to shut them all down right now. And the ability to have that conversation on a broad scale is important. This is kind of a funny slide, right? So, and it goes to Michelle. Your question is, how do you move rapidly to enhance the cybersecurity program? And the answer, like a good consultant, is it depends. Right? I'm not going to tell you there's a black and white single answer, because there's not, and it depends on where your organization stands today. Depends on your internal skills, your focus, your budget, all those types of things. My assertion in this presentation is that the best place to start is to include the topic of cybersecurity in your strategic planning process. If you have a regular board meeting, you have a regular leadership meeting where you're talking about key issues, items, and objectives that the organization is looking to achieve, start simply by bringing it up and saying, what is our plan? What do we have vendors that can support us? Do we have people internally we can lean on that might have skills or interest? Do we have board members that have some exposure, interest, availability to focus on this as well? And then start the topic. Understand what your objectives are as an organization. What are the events, the both positive and negative, that can affect you? And then build the strategic planning process that it aligns to those priorities, right? maybe spending money on protecting a bunch of fringe machines, the iPads that the kids use for looking at the web in the corner of the museum, is less important because they're not connected to the network than it is to protect something in the finance department or in the executive director's office, or in the fundraising department, development department, right, where the crown jewels are. Starting this process and having that conversation is very important. The goal here is to talk about the fact that this, like we said, it's not a technology problem. Collaborate with your team members, ask the questions, have transparency with the board. The more transparency typically you have with the board and the leadership team that says we are not prepared to your, and I think, Michelle, I think you alluded to that earlier, where do we even start, right? Is to have that transparency in that conversation and then get to an integrated approach. One of the biggest risks that we see is that different departments or teams or groups within an organization might have separate funding or separate programs or separate initiatives, and because we're not collaborating or being transparent or talking about it, I've now stood up a machine over in this corner of the museum that's now connected to the network because I got a grant for this one program. Now it's connected to the network, but it's exposed everybody else to issues because it wasn't part of a cohesive plan. So that's the concept with integration. And governance is the ongoing conversation and leveraging that framework. Even if you're a 3-person team, you can still have a framework for ongoing conversation. All right. Oh, there it goes. So how many people on the phone process donations online?
We do.
We do.
I got a couple. I'm assuming most people do now, right? So you may or may not know that that exposure for credit card fraud and so forth occurs with your vendor, with the systems that you pull the information in with as well, with the people who are using or processing on your side, as well as elements of having social engineering, like we talked about earlier, that can circle back on this too. So there are many situations where nonprofits, especially because of things we talked about earlier, around education, awareness, capability, and so forth, have been hit by, hey, your donation system isn't working. I tried to make a donation. They call and they talk to somebody and say, hey, I'm going to give you my credit card number. Can you give me the rest of the information that I put in there? Or they ask questions around it to try to get you to give other information for somebody. The social engineering side is really interesting. And so having policies and procedures around how, why, and where we're doing this, and working with your partner and vendor to understand those is really, really important. Okay, just a little break between the topic here. So what are some of the threats going on here? Frequency and complexity of attacks is increasing every single day. The type of risk for organizations is increasing every day. This is not something that we can sit back and wait on and hope that it's going to get better. It is something we have to be proactive about. When we talked earlier about we haven't updated Windows XP and we haven't done that, primarily those things occur, yes, due to lack of funding, but that funding is the result of priority. And do we understand what the risks of the organization is? That's why the support from the top is a necessity. People don't necessarily have to understand the individual types of attacks and how to defend it and those kind of things, but they have to understand how to have the conversation. And which drives you to align cybersecurity with the other mission-driven initiatives and including your strategic planning process. And then increasing collaboration, communication transparency like we talked about. Get the word out. Know that this is important. Tie it to your mission. Understand that your reputation is at risk, and then apply the governance principles throughout. We talk a little bit about the governance principles. I didn't provide specific examples, but simply having things like policies and procedures. What is your new hire onboarding policy? Do people know what type of access for use of internet in your facility is allowed? Do people know what your password policies and controls are? Do people know how you're supposed to use the organization provided devices? Are people within your organization allowed to take data and information from the organization on their personal devices outside of premises or to other locations? Having those governance principles discussed, collaborated with, and communicated with are things that you can do without spending a lot of money. You can start that today to make an impact immediately. There are policies and procedure examples on the internet. I think Cam has actually provided some links in the past to some templates and so forth, and they're good places to start, as well as organizations like Armanino and other organizations that have provided examples to museums and nonprofits as well. When we get towards the end here, the biggest thing that we can do to hurt ourselves is make ourselves more complex, right? The goals as an organization to aim for integration. How do we simplify our ecosystem? So you asked a question earlier about what do we talk to about with our providers and so forth. How complex are we? Do we have a bunch of endpoints and points of risk that aren't controlled? What does that mean? How do we consolidate to fewer devices with more capabilities on our premises, right? And how do we automate as much as possible across our devices to eliminate manual touch points that provide risk points for intrusion or other malicious intent? And I'll leave it there. There's a lot of broad, heady topics, but I'm open to have a lot of questions here if you like.
While you guys work on typing your questions, I'm going to just make sure that I'm going to take care of some of the wrap up in case anybody needs to move on. But I know that Ryan and Julia are welcome to stay on and answer any questions. If you're not already a CAM member, I want to encourage you to consider joining as an individual, institution, or even as a business member if you happen to be a business associate here. I want to thank both Ryan and Julia for lending their expertise today. And for Julia for being our CAM fellow. She'll be at our 2019 conference. The other thing I want to mention is the 2019 conference is going to be February 7, 8, and 9 in San Francisco. And we'll be at the Park 55 Hotel. The preliminary program will be released probably in mid to late September, so we look forward to being able to share that, but registration is open. Michelle says that she'd like CAM to provide some policy template links. I'll see what we have on file and see what we've provided in the past, and also link that potentially as I post this webinar online as a recording afterwards. Once again, thank you to Ryan and Julia. They're going to go ahead and stay on. I'm going to stop the recording as we take questions. A big thanks to everyone for attending today, and we'll see you all soon at the next CAM activity.